Hi everyone, my name is Laureen Elgert. I teach environmental studies and international development at Worcester Polytechnic Institute in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm going to share with you a bit about some work I've been doing over the last couple of years regarding constitutional environmental rights and their relationship with post-development and popular resistance against extractivism. And my case study comes from Ecuador. Okay, so Rafael Correa and his center-left party called the Alianza País were voted into the Ecuadorian presidency on a platform of the citizens' revolution and the socialist reconstruction of the country. This was part of the larger pink wave in Latin America that saw many leftist leaders gain control over governments that had long been dominated by domestic and international neoliberal policies and the corresponding dismantling of the social welfare systems in Latin American countries. Ecuador, as elsewhere, had been subject to humiliating and impoverishing impacts of IMF and World Bank policies, including structural adjustments in privatizing and liberalizing access to resources for extractive industries. So Ecuador's newest constitution was a direct response to these decades of underdevelopment, and it was developed through deeply participatory processes of consultation with diverse constituents and representatives of the citizenry, including indigenous federations and associations, and it was voted on and approved in 2008. The Constitution embodied what more broadly was known as post-development, a broad-based rejection of the neoliberalization of the global development project writ large. Motivated by anti-Americanism and anti-globalization, or in other words, anti-IMF and anti-World Bankism, more broadly, the Constitution represented a sort of new beginning for Ecuador that was to be marked above all by sovereignty. So Buen Vivir is one of the central concepts around which the 2008 Constitution was constructed. It was positioned as the development model to replace American domination and neoliberalism. 5-year national plans that seek to realize and operationalize the Constitution talk about sovereignty, decolonization, and post-capitalism. Buen Vivir, or Sumak Kausai in Quechua, means the good way of living, and it eschews development based on purely economic assessments for development that considers the individual, the community, and the environment. It promotes living in harmony with and respecting others and nature. It is a development model that has gained attention in Latin American countries as they reconcile human development with society and environment. In the context of Buen Vivir, it may not seem surprising that in 2008, the Constitution formally recognized the rights of nature. But indeed, it was the first in the world, and the only one in the world as of yet to do so. Rights of nature institutionalizes the premise that nature has inalienable rights, just as humans do. This premise is a radical departure from the assumption that nature is property under law, as it asserts that nature in all its life forms has the right to exist, persist, maintain, and regenerate its vital cycles. And we, the people, have the legal authority to enforce these rights on behalf of ecosystems. The ecosystem itself can be named the defendant. So after the new constitution was voted in and adopted, Correa's government swiftly began reshaping the Ecuadorian society and the economy in accordance with its principles. Well, some of its principles. First, Correa reduced the influence of the IMF and the World Bank in Ecuador by ceasing to take further loans from the IMF and declaring the existing national debt to the international banks illegitimate, illegal, and immoral. Drawing on the concept of odious debt born during the debt crisis of the 80s, he threatened to fight this in international courts. He defaulted on $3 billion in bonds and ultimately managed to reduce Ecuador's debt by 60%. He also worked to demonstrate his anti-Americanism. In 2008, Correa shut down US military bases in Ecuador, and in 2011, he ousted US Ambassador Heather Hodges after emails were leaked that expressed her concern about government transparency. After years of threatening, in 2014, he kicked out US aid from the country, accusing them of interfering in Latin American nations like Ecuador under the pretext of strengthening democracy, but really with the intention of destabilizing governments through funding of certain citizens and groups. That's quote unquote. In 2012, Correa granted asylum to Julian Assange, famously. Correa also increased social spending. He invested massive amounts in the degraded health and education sectors. He raised the minimum wage. He funded infrastructure. Over his 2 terms, Correa significantly reduced poverty from 36% to 22%. His policies reduced inequality, measured by the Gini coefficient, from 0.55 to 0.47. But 2 of Correa's moves were more controversial than all of this. The first was that Correa's vision for Ecuador did not exclude large-scale resource extraction, but actually leaned heavily on projected revenues from mining, spearheaded by the development of 5 strategic projects. They were called strategic projects, including copper, silver, and gold mines. Correa's administration passed the 2009 mining law that granted new allowances, relaxing regulations, and creating incentives for large-scale mining investments. When challenged that the mining law was in direct contradiction to buen vivir and the rights of nature enshrined in the Constitution, Correa begged to differ, saying that the country would pursue responsible mining and would be subject to environmental impact assessments, and famously said, "We cannot be beggars sitting on a mountain of gold." The second move was to seek new sources of financing for social and infrastructure projects, given Ecuador's declining credit rating and Correa's desire to demonstrate Ecuador's independence and sovereignty from the US, American banks, and the global financial architecture. These new sources of funding came in the form of Chinese loans. The government called this diversifying the economy by reducing dependence on one creditor. By 2015, China is supplying billions in loans, over 65% of Ecuador's external financing, and as part of the deal, Correa has committed Amazonian oil to the order of 95,000 barrels per day, nearly 90% of Ecuador's oil production, sealing Ecuador's commitment to oil drilling. Over this time, scholars recognize that Ecuador is experiencing a drift towards more authoritarian tendencies. Environmental and indigenous organizations that protested the mining law in particular were branded terrorists by Correa's government. Environmental NGOs were shut down, and there was a general clampdown on civil society. Correa presented a decree in 2013 limiting the ability of NGOs and citizens associations to exist and limiting free association or membership. International organizations were prohibited from participating in actions or campaigns that undermine public peace and security. Correa's government was found to be spying on opponents of the mining law and environmentalists, monitoring their bank accounts, phone records, associates, and daily activities. So one looks at Ecuador after 2009 and sees much that contrasts with the constitutional promise. The 2009 mining law seems in direct contrast to buen vivir and in direct violation of the rights of nature. The clampdown and discredit of environmental activists and indigenous groups in particular seems to absolutely undermine the constitutional esteem granted them, both through the Buen Vivir and through the rights of nature. But while some reports call this contradictory or hypocritical, I think it's worthwhile to go back and view Corea's project as one primarily focused on post-development, albeit with environmental implications. Rights of nature found its way into the constitutional text, largely due to the discourse coalition of local environmental organizations, local indigenous and rural associations were largely concerned with the maintaining and strengthening community rights and access to resources, and global environmental organizations, in particular, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature. They are primarily interested in incubating a model of environmental regulation for the world to follow, to scale up. There was also the contributions of Alberto Acosta, then Minister of Natural Resources, who took a lead role in coordinating the development of the Constitution and who had a strong personal interest in making sure that rights of nature made the final cut. But perhaps most importantly, Buen Vivir and rights of nature were widely understood and portrayed as a way of defeating neoliberalism in Ecuador. Using documents from the Constitutional Assembly's plenary debates, Cristina Espinosa, in her 2019 paper, demonstrates that the construction of the Constitution was structured around a systematic critique of neoliberalism. And in these deliberations, Buen Vivir and rights of nature fit the bill. While for some, Buen Vivir and rights of nature invoked tighter environmental regulation and a move away from extractivism, these were associated in post-development discourses in Ecuador as going hand in hand with anti-imperialism and anti-global capitalism and anti-Americanism, all the while promoting sovereignty and an independent pathway to development. So the principal work of the concept is as an alternative to mainstream development at the national level, rather than the questioning of environmental exploitation at the local level. Environmentalism, environmental protection, becomes a sort of discursive parasite along for the ride and understood to be loosely associated with anti-Americanism and anti-colonialism and anti-global capitalism that are primarily blamed for environmental destruction. There's another point I'd like to make regarding that cooperation between local and global environmental groups and rural and indigenous organizations that turned out to be so vital in the work of getting rights of nature included in the Constitution. Scholars have pointed out that environmentalism has created these alliances and that these alliances have benefited local people in their struggles and to access and protect land, water, forests, etc. I've made the argument elsewhere that the discourse of responsible extraction, be it agriculture or mining or oil drilling, etc., can erode these alliances by creating incentives for environmentalists to seek gains, even marginal gains, through cooperation with industry instead of antagonism. So that gives us an idea of how Buen Vivir and rights of nature got into the Constitution. And now that they're there, how have they been mobilized in environmental governance? Well, the story of the Condor Mirador mine began in 2000 when the Ecuadorian government sold mineral exploration rights to a Canadian mining company in the southeastern province of Zamora Chinchipe. The company found evidence of copper deposits in the area and applied for the license to begin excavation. Protests and resistance became too much for the company to withstand, both in Ecuador and in Canada. And in 2010, they sold the rights to a Chinese company, Ecuacorriente, who began excavation. In 2013, a coalition of local environmentalists and indigenous associations brought a case to the national courts against the Ecuadorian government to challenge the constitutional legality of its agreement with Ecuacorriente that provided this mining concession, including rights to around 15,000 acres of land. The case was argued on the basis that the concession including rights to, the case was argued on the basis that the concession would violate the rights of nature. The company would open up to 6 open pit mines and use additional land for constructing dumps, tailing ponds, and chemical extraction facilities. The deal required an environmental impact assessment, and indeed one was conducted by Walsh Consultants in Ecuador. The assessment detailed the size of the scar that would be left by the pits, and they made these really interesting and poignant comparisons with the size of certain landmarks that would be very familiar to Ecuadorians. So it really kind of brought this report and the environmental impact assessment sort of, into the consciousness of Ecuadorians. So they said the size that would be left by the pits would be the equivalent to the altitude of 10 buildings similar to Quito's Basilica. The waste material that would be created by the excavation would be 60,000 tons of rock per day. The water consumption of the mine, the water consumption of the mine would be 140 liters of water per second. The energy consumption would be the equivalent of the city of Ibarra with 130,000 people. The toxic waste and high potential for water pollution and the disruption and possible extinction of at least 3 endemic amphibian species. These were all part of the environmental impact assessment. So the environmental impact statement provided clear evidence that this was a strong case for the violation of the rights of nature. But in 2013, the advocates lost the case. Judges ruled that the mine did not violate rights of nature for 2 reasons. The first one was that the affected area was not in a protected area, and therefore the project did not affect nature. The second one was that the judge put public interest of development before the private interest of the plaintiffs to stop the mine. In 2014, a Shuar indigenous activist who lobbied tirelessly against the Condor Mirador mine, his name was Jose Tendetza. He was found with his hands bound and other signs of torture on his body. Police investigations concluded that Jose died from a fishing accident. The Rio Blanco mine, on the other hand, is sort of the second case, and this had a more happy fate. The Rio Blanco mine is situated in the southern Andean highlands in the province of Azuay, adjacent to El Cajas National Park. And that's what's pictured here is a shot from El Cajas, a famous shot from El Cajas. So it's also situated close to the highland communities of Moyeturo and Chaucha. These are small highland communities close to El Cajas National Park. El Cajas is predominantly alpine tundra and was once described to me as a giant sponge. El Cajas feeds several watersheds, and it is the principal source of water for the city of Cuenca, the capital city of Azuay. The mine was sold by an American company to Equa Gold Mining, a Chinese company, in 2013, and gold and silver production began in the mine in 2016. Early in 2018, people from local communities asked researchers from the University of Azuay to conduct some water tests because they suspected that contaminants were being discharged from the mine and into the river. Indeed, they became desperate when they found out that this was true, and the conflict between the Rio Blanco communities and the Equa Gold Mining escalated. The conflict in Rio Blanco became weekly news as tensions rose around roadblocks, violent clashes, militarization. The workers' housing was blown up with the company's own dynamite. Activists were kidnapped and tortured and rescued by a group of journalists. It was a very dramatic time. I was there for part of this time, and I can attest to the drama of it all, and the daily developments of this conflict. On June 1st, 2018, the headlines read, "When the Impossible Happens." The provincial court ordered Equa Gold Mining to suspend mining operations, citing lack of free and prior informed consent. This was the first time that a court held up the right to free prior informed consent since Ecuador ratified the ILO Convention in 1989, and the first time that it upheld its own legislation on prior consultation. The state, not the company, appealed the decision. Not the company, the state appealed the decision, and the court struck down the appeal and confirmed that decision on August 3rd, 2018. This was the first time in Ecuador's history that an active mine was shut down. While the case was not argued on the basis of buen vivir or rights of nature exclusively, both were invoked by the ruling judge in the decision, and do seem to have had a not insignificant influence on the case. The ruling emphasized the need to overcome human domination over the environment in order to give way to a biocentric view, which is the basis of rights of nature, and to support and advance the principle of buen vivir, referring to a dignified life in harmony and balance with the universe, the human being, and nature. So this is a photo of people from the town of Molle Toro after the judge's ruling to shut down the Rio Blanco mine. They came out to confirm that gold production had in fact ceased. I just think this is the most beautiful photo. And at the risk of romanticizing it and the case overall, this really is what community resistance looks like. So Rio Blanco was not the most stringent test for rights of nature or buen vivir. There was widespread support for the closure of the mine among middle-class Ecuadorians in the region, particularly on the basis that El Cajas and the watersheds that it feeds are the principal water source for the affluent city of Cuenca, one of the few, if not the only cities in Ecuador that boasts potable tap water. El Cajas is significant internationally also as a UNESCO Man and Biosphere Reserve. The ruling also referenced a national referendum held in 2018, right after the election of Correa's successor, Lenin Moreno. And one of the questions asked about permitting mining in protected areas. 68% of the respondents nationally answered that mining should be prohibited in and near protected areas. But perhaps it is not the least critical test of buen vivir and rights of nature either. Shutting down the mine forfeited a tens of millions of dollars deal, and the new administration is explicitly on a mission to attract foreign investment. A goal to which shutting down the mine that embodies nearly 20 years of investment is antithetical, to say the least. So I guess the grand questions that are raised by these cases, by both the Condor Mirador case and the Rio Blanco case, really the questions they beg are, can rights of nature and buen vivir stake new discursive terrain for land struggles and socio-environmental justice more generally? Can rights of nature and buen vivir provide new points of resistance against the Ecuadorian government? And I guess the Rio Blanco case in particular shows that there is potential for this, but I would also like to offer a cautionary note about potentially uncritical optimism of rights of nature, for supporting and rallying for the rights of local people and their rights, access to resources and rights over local land. So given the diversity and complexity of natural systems globally, the knowledge and rights of land users and resource users locally, and the contingency of politics of global environmental expertise, I think that the rights of nature could lead to misguided, even if well-intentioned policy and action, could lead to injustices and unanticipated environmental degradation. We have seen this happen time and time again in the context of conservation and its violent environments. Payment for environmental services, where universal assumptions and monetization and commodification of nature that were meant to empower and incentivize local people to conservation have stripped people of their rights and access, and work to further concentrate power and wealth, not to mention environmental degradation. All the while, expectations for environmental improvements are naive and best, and misrepresentations at worst. Despite that rights of nature is often positioned as congruent and supportive of local rights, and is in many cases congruent and supportive of local rights to land and access to resources, given the mixed and dubious record of conservation to be just as much an engine of displacement and disenfranchisement as resource extraction, it needs to be approached with critical appraisal. And rights of nature, I would argue, could also become a tool for exclusion and to overrule resource protectors. So as a sort of postscript to this presentation, there's also a sort of debate around whether or not rights of nature and buen vivir can, what will happen to these concepts and their role in public discourse as Ecuador moves back towards the IMF, global financial institutions, and austerity, and for all intents and purposes, sort of neoliberal policies. What will happen to buen vivir and rights of nature? In 2017, or sorry, in April of 2018, Lenin Moreno, who took power from Correa took power in 2017. In 2018, he announced a new policy package to help the country get out of its debt, mostly to China. And this package included increasing the country's attractiveness to foreign investors by slashing the government bureaucracy in half, by 50%, selling off government assets and companies. And these photos here from the Washington Post are were taken a few months ago, November of 2019. When hundreds of thousands of people took to the streets across the entire country to protest a loan deal that Lenin Moreno made with the IMF that included slashing fuel subsidies and other structural adjustments to public spending. So what remains of rights of nature and buen vivir after this sort of return to the IMF and austerity is yet to be seen. Thank you very much for your attention. I really look forward to our discussion.